My personal leadership style tends to be very collaborative, consensus building. I work really hard to make sure everyone at the table has an opportunity to speak to whatever it is we're discussing. And as a general rule, whenever we're having a discussion where we're sharing our opinions as a group, as a team, sharing our perspectives, our viewpoints on a topic, I think let's just use that also as a prompter to create space for Jesus to share his opinions. After all, I think if Jesus were here in the room with us, in the flesh, would we really just talk amongst ourselves and yet never ask him? Jesus, it's really good that you're here. It was so nice to talk to you at the start, when we did that nice little opening prayer thing. And don't worry, Jesus, we'll talk to you before we leave. But between now and then, Jesus, we don't really want you to concern yourself with the actual work we're doing. We got this. Oh, that might be a little tongue-in-cheek. But I have felt so much conviction around this. If Jesus were here in the flesh with us, I find it hard to imagine that any church leader would actually take that approach with him. We'll give a shout out at the beginning of the meeting, a shout out at the end. So I think, why would we do this? Simply because we can't see him with our physical eyes. Because we can be sure he most certainly is with us in the room. In fact, even more amazing, he dwells within us, each one of us, by his Spirit. So in general, I find that if we are discussing the same topic for more than 40, 45 minutes, it's probably time to stop the conversation and check in with Jesus for any further insight, counsel, or direction. We would certainly do that if he were in the room, right? In the flesh, that's how we would approach it. And so many times I'll just stop the conversation and just invite the room to give Jesus our full attention. And then just to ask him, so Jesus, what do you think about all this? What is important to you in this discussion? What do you want to highlight or draw attention to from what has been shared so far? Do you have an opinion on this? Are we missing anything? Now, it's possible that Jesus doesn't have a particular opinion on what we're discussing at times. I don't always have an opinion on which game my kids play as they're deciding how they're going to spend their afternoon. And that's fine. I just think Jesus likes to be included in the conversation at times, especially when it's about his church. Doesn't seem reasonable? So that's one habit we try to operate by. If we have an opinion on something, well, let's use that as a prompt. Jesus, do you have an opinion on this as well? And then the third leadership habit we developed over a period of time was to use the why question, not just the what or how question. We have found this to be so helpful when it comes to discernment, because this is where we find God will often share his heart and why something is important to him. Sometimes we can get narrowly focused on, what do we do, Jesus, and how do we do it? And yet we have found that through asking Jesus why, we often receive additional insight that helps affirm that we really are hearing his voice. And often it solidifies our way forward. Often the why question helps us get to the deeper things that are on Jesus' heart. And as we continue in this series, I'm going to share a bunch of stories that provide examples for how our 10 foundational convictions get worked out, and also how these 3 leadership habits get worked out and what our experience has been. But as a general habit, when we are discerning on someone, this is such a valuable question and part of the discernment process. Why is this important to you, Jesus? Of all the things we could focus on, give our energy to, why this? Why now? Or why are you saying no to this or not now? We have found this to be far more helpful and insightful than we might at first realize. And again, I'll share some stories about this in a future session here. For now, before we continue, I'm just going to encourage you just to pause and practice. Ask Jesus, from what I've heard so far, what do you want me or what do you want us to take special notice of? What is important for us to pay careful attention to? I encourage you, just take notice of your reaction to what you've heard so far. Is there an openness to what it is I'm sharing? Are you experiencing resistance? Do you experience excitement, hope? Or maybe you're feeling fear or skepticism? Again, I encourage you just pause for a few moments, share with those around you what is lingering in your mind as you consider some of what we've talked about so far. part of the session, I'm just going to share a bunch of stories that help illustrate many of the ideas that I've been speaking to. Jesus, I really believe, taught our elders, our staff, our church on a variety of different things through these stories, and really integrates what we've been talking about so far. And perhaps he'll raise some things that are important to him for you as I share some of these. You won't be overly impressed with some of these stories, and that's part of the point. I hope you'll listen to them and think, that's not that hard. We could do this. Exactly. I hope they open up your imagination to what is remarkably accessible to us. If we really wanted to, if we made a choice to submit to Jesus as the functional head of the church, if we really wanted to invite him to lead us in real time, there is a way to do this. I hope you're encouraged by how accessible this is to normal people, normal leadership teams, normal church teams. One of the first things I really learned in this whole journey was about the primacy of humility. And one of our foundational convictions, shared it earlier, humility is paramount. And so this story was only about 2 months into my own kind of learning journey. And one of the fears is, as I talk with people, is what if we do this in a group, but then we hear different things? What do you do then? Well, there was a conference that I was considering sending one of our staff members to, but I wasn't sure if this was the best stewardship of our limited financial resources at the time. And I really wanted this person to be able to go. I wanted to affirm them in their ministry, but I just wasn't sure. There was a significant amount of money for us at the time. And so I started asking Jesus about this. What do you think, Jesus? Should we send this person to this conference? And despite the fact that I personally really wanted the person to go, my sense was that the answer was no. But I didn't want that to be the answer. So I brought in another staff member to try to hear something differently. And I asked them to pray with me about this. And so we agreed we're going to spend a week and we're just going to ask Jesus what his intention was for this staff member. A week later, we got together and I said to them, so what do you think Jesus might be saying? Again, I was still sensing the answer was no. You know what they said? They said, I think we should send them. It sort of seems like we're hearing opposite things, doesn't it? And I'm thinking like, great, now what do I do? So I was still feeling like the Lord was saying no, but in those moments as I talked to this other team member, I just felt an internal release that, it's okay. We should just invite this person to go. And so honestly, I was a little bit confused by that. So I thought, Lord, I thought you were saying no, but I'm just learning and I'm not infallible. And I thought, I'd rather err on the side of generosity because it seemed to me at the time like only one of us could be right? One of us sensed yes, one of us sensed no. What do we do with that? In this particular case, we ended up asking this person to go, and they responded that they would love to, that it meant so much to them that we had made this available to them. But then they let us know that they were already committed during that same time frame, and they would have to decline. And in those moments when they expressed this, I just felt Jesus whisper to my heart, Jeremy, this is why you always listen carefully and don't make assumptions. This is why you need humility. I felt like he was saying to me, you were actually both hearing me correctly. I did want you to ask this person to go because I knew they would feel loved and affirmed, but I also knew that no, they were not going to go to this event. You were both right, but I deliberately didn't give either of you the whole picture. And there was a reason for that. This is a crucial lesson for you, Jeremy. Don't make assumptions about what I've said, what it means, how things will play out. Always, always, always be humble. Always realize that whatever you do here needs to be tested. And wherever possible, invite others to listen with you. And when you hear something, don't assume you always know what it means. Keep asking me about this. Ask me follow-up questions. Like the why question can be helpful here. So we need humility in this. All right, another story, another example that demonstrates the need for humility happened one time when we were trying to discern whether we should move forward with a particular ministry program in our church. It happened to be the marriage course by Alpha. This had been an ongoing conversation for a while in our team. And on one hand, we might think, why do we need to ask Jesus about this? Marriages need help. We've got people willing to lead this ministry. is this not obvious? And we did have some leaders who wanted to see it go forward, but we had a number of logistical challenges we were trying to manage and limited resources to pull it off. And so our team had a variety of opinions on the matter. Should we move forward with this in this season or not? So we went to listening prayer as a team, asked Jesus this question: how should we move forward? And one of our pastors, who shared this with me later, had come into that conversation convinced that we needed to move forward with this particular marriage ministry. And when we went to listening prayer, she saw a traffic light, kind of red, yellow, green. And the first thought that came to her mind was, oh, good, green light, move forward. But then as we were continuing to be quiet there, she just had a sense that Jesus was saying to her, take a closer look at the traffic light. And so just in her mind's eye, she realized, oh, it's actually a red light. And though she was very surprised, because of her own commitment to obedience, one of our foundational convictions, she disclosed she just felt an immediate settledness that the Lord was saying that this was a red light, a stoplight, and that we were not to move forward with it at that time. So since that time, we have learned that it can be helpful in listening prayer with our team to sometimes just ask Jesus to show us, Jesus, are you giving us a red light, a yellow light, or a green light on this particular matter? Another story, speaking to the why question. So another time I was doing some listening prayer around a major capital campaign, $13 million project. And I was sitting with the Lord trying to discern his voice as it relates to the process of fundraising and timing and vision for this project. And I've got my listening prayer journal out because journaling brings focus, one of our convictions. And one of the questions I asked him was, Jesus, why do you want us to engage in this building project? Why now? This church is not my church, and the size of this project is overwhelming to me. I know not everyone will understand our motives. Jesus, why are you leading us in this? I don't know, what I was sort of expecting Jesus to say was something along the lines of, vision to reach the lost, or to better accommodate student ministry, to better serve our community, to have a more inviting worship space, like those kinds of things. But that is not what I sensed the Lord saying to me that day. You know what I sensed he might be saying? I wrote this down. I sensed him saying, Jeremy, we are doing this now because I want to teach my people to put me first. And nothing highlights the posture of your hearts quite like how you steward my money. I sensed him saying, I wrote this down in my journal, Jeremy, you have, along with the church leadership, have been praying and leading people over the last 4 years to put me first in everything. And it's time to really put that into motion. It's time to engage in a project that will lay bare the true posture of people's hearts. And they'll have an opportunity to choose who is first in their life. That's ultimately why we are doing this now. It's not about a building. I don't need a building. It's about your hearts. And this needs to be your priority during this project. And I remember sitting back in my chair and thinking, oh, there's just a weight to this. And then almost as a kind of follow-up, I just sensed the Lord saying, Jeremy, by the way, I don't want your charitable giving. I don't need your money. I don't need your charity. What I'm looking for is wholehearted obedience, trust, and a tangible demonstration that there are no other idols before me. Asking the why question was really helpful and ended up framing nearly all of our fundraising communication for the next 4 to 5 years. Whatever else was happening with this project, this was important to Jesus because of the hard issues he was seeking to address in our church family. So another story, I'm sure common in your experience. We had a request come to our elders board from a student who was going on a 7-week missions trip one summer. Student had done a fantastic job of raising a bunch of her own support, but still needed some further funds, and so made a formal request to our elders for some money. So as was our practice, we stopped to ask Jesus what he thought. And I prayed asking Jesus the question and said something like, Jesus, what is your heart on this matter? This isn't our church. It certainly is not our money. It's your church, it's your money, and you can do with it whatever you want. And so, Jesus, the question is simple. Have you set aside money to help send this teenager to Africa? And as an elders board, we paused for a few minutes in silence, and then I simply asked the question, so what do you think Jesus might be saying? And these are the kinds of things that surfaced. One person said, as soon as you started praying about, have you set aside money, they had a sense that Jesus was saying, what's most important here is that I've set aside this student for my work. It's like, oh, okay, that felt significant. Someone else said they had the image of a slingshot and that we were to be part of launching this student to serve Jesus around the world. Someone else said they sensed Jesus saying, your whole purpose is to send people out. If you are faithful to do that, you will never lack financial resources. You just need to be about sending people. We're hearing these kinds of things. Let me ask you, what do you think Jesus was saying? If you'd been around that table and those were the kinds of things that were lingering in the hearts and minds of those present, what would you conclude that Jesus wanted us to do? Now, if any one of those elders had been praying on their own, they wouldn't have had the same confirmation that what they were hearing, that what they thought Jesus might be saying was actually what Jesus had in mind. But as previously expressed, one of our convictions is that listening with others accelerates confidence. And in this case, along with countless others, we had confidence that we knew what Jesus was asking us to do with his money in the student. All right, another story. This time with this particular story, we had a kids' discipleship strategy that involves teaching kids to hear God's voice, getting them out into the community to serve, and to really teach them to learn how to share their faith. And one of the outcomes of this ministry was one of the 10, 11-year-old boys wanted to get baptized. It's like, awesome. This boy had some anxiety realities, and he had seen doctors about some of his struggles. And so he wanted to be baptized, but he was afraid to do it in front of the whole church. And so he asked if he could be baptized at this midweek discipleship ministry. So what do you do with that? My guess is that you may have a theological framework that lends itself to certain conclusions about how this kind of thing might be handled. We certainly did. But the circumstances here seem to warrant just a bit more consideration. So we met as a pastoral team to discuss it. And I had someone bring some biblical study on baptism, so we'd all be starting from the same place. Again, steeping in the scriptures is crucial. We talked about logistical concerns, precedent kinds of things. If we do this for this boy, will others want to do that? And a variety of things. But then we simply asked Jesus what he wanted us to do. After all, our heart is that he would have functional leadership, which means our posture is he can have whatever he wants. So I would have said something like, okay, Jesus, you are well aware of the situation we are discussing. We celebrate what you are doing in this young boy, and we want to respond in a way that fans into flame the work of the Spirit in him. We don't want to do anything that would quench your Spirit. And we could debate both sides of how best to do this. But at the end of the day, all that matters is what you want. Jesus, how are we to care for this boy's heart in the context of a church community? And after a period of time in silence, I asked the team, so what do you think Jesus might be saying? In this instance, people shared from a variety of different vantage points. A few people shared ways in which, if we did make provision for him to be baptized midweek, that we could share the story with the whole church on Sunday morning via video. And this is sort of like long before COVID, when video we weren't using it in that way at that time. Some had a thought, well, what if we had some elders present representing the wider church? Some shared a sense of Jesus' heart for the boy, that Jesus was excited about the steps he was taking, affirming this would be a significant step in his journey, like those kinds of things. One person around our table was reminded of the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, and how the whole church wasn't present, but it was still right to be baptized. So again, in the end, what do you think we decided? I think this particular time we did a second round of listening prayer and said, so Jesus, it seems to us like you're giving us freedom to support this boy's journey through special provision this time. Are we missing anything? Are we hearing correctly? Is this you, Jesus? Paused again. And there was just a complete sense of peace and a unity of spirit in the room. And so we move forward. Now, whenever we meet to listen in prayer for a situation like this, I always want to make sure that those who are impacted by the decision are aware of the journey and what we sensed Jesus might have been saying. So in this case, I had our children's pastor reach out to the parents of this boy, not just to share the decision that, yes, we were going to make provision for a midweek baptism, but I had her write down the things that we believed Jesus to be saying to us so that she could encourage them. And this has been an important part of creating a culture where this is normal and where our people expect us as leadership to be literally listening to Jesus on these kinds of things. Now, again, in this story, share this with the parents. They were grateful for our listening approach, thanked us for that. But then what was really exciting for us is that when we communicated, and with our children's pastor communicating with this 10, 11-year-old boy the decision, he thanked us, but said that he too had been asking Jesus about this. And he sensed Jesus was saying to him that Jesus would give him the courage to share with the whole church. And so he did. He was baptized shortly thereafter on a Sunday morning. So this stuff is not rocket science, is it? But it's a habit of being intentional to look for places to invite Jesus' input. It's saying, so we've got an opinion on this. Jesus, do you have an opinion? Is this important to you? Why is it important to you? So saying we could debate the pros and cons for a long time. There's a variety of valid perspectives. And of course, we did do some of that in this instance. We talked about the biblical evidence. We talked about precedents. If we make exception, well, other kids want to do this and so on. But at the end of the day, Jesus is the head of the church, and we seek to submit to him. All right, another story. When I first had the conscious thought that I wanted us as a church leadership, staff and elders in particular, to start making our default pattern one of asking Jesus questions within our meetings, giving him space to speak, to discern his will, I think even subconsciously I had a certain expectation of what that would be like. Having never done it before, or seen it done before, or really even heard of it being done before, I think I thought Jesus would speak through fairly direct sort of, yes or no answers. Jesus, should we do this? Yes. Should we do that? No. Jesus, do you want me to do this or that? But what I learned early on is that Jesus speaks in much more nuanced ways, and this is so important to understand. So we have a touring worship artist who is part of our church. And for several years, we had a deliberate partnership with this individual. And at one point, he asked us if he could do a CD release of New Kids' worship album on a Sunday morning instead of having a separate CD release event, as would have been his pattern. We'd done that with him before. And to be honest, I really wasn't sure what the best way forward was here. Because of my own friendship with this individual, because we as a church are in partnership with him, I certainly felt a strong pull towards making allowance for this. And yet at the same time, I had questions about whether or not Sunday morning was the right place for this. I wondered, would this add to or take away from our focus on Jesus as first? Jesus is the one we want to promote when we gather for worship, not anyone or anything else. And so I wrestled with it personally for several days. Like, Jesus, what do you think here? What's your will? Sunday morning does not belong to me. And so then I brought it to our team. And as I've often reflected, we don't have to guess as to whether or not we should do this. This is Jesus' church. He's the head. He knows what he wants. Our desire is that he can have whatever he wants. And so at a team meeting, we asked Jesus this question. Jesus is not our church. It's your church. And Sunday mornings belong to you. You can have whatever you want. What do you think? Do you want this individual to do his CD release as part of a Sunday morning gathering? And we waited. And again, when I first envisioned what these group listening experiences might entail, my assumption was something like that in a case like this, Jesus would say, yes, do it on a Sunday morning, or no, find another place. End of story. But as I've learned, it's rarely like that. What we heard that day was this, and I know because we wrote these things down. One person heard, he's my son, and I delight in him. Someone else heard the Lord say, I am the one who established this partnership. This was my idea. Someone else had a sense the Lord was saying not to be concerned that money was clouding the issue. That selling CDs on a Sunday morning would be a distraction. And their sense was that if this was this individual's primary motivation, trying to make money by having more people be at the event, then he would host a CD release party where he could sell tickets, because that's not going to happen, of course, on a Sunday morning. And just this sense that money was not the driving factor for this request. Someone else, their sense was the Lord just saying, trust his heart in this. Again, speaking to motive. Now, someone else, as we were just quiet before the Lord, had a sense the Lord is saying, you released him to do it outside the walls of the church, to go and lead people in worship, knowing he would sell CDs and whatnot. Why not welcome him to do it inside his home church? So again, not a simple yes or no answer, but if you were there in the room with us, what would you have concluded Jesus was likely saying? It's not that anyone around the table heard Jesus say, yes, do the CD release on a Sunday morning, but the various nuances of what we did here made it clear to us that we should gladly welcome him to come and do this in this specific instance. Now, a bit about an aside here, pause for a moment. Why do you suppose he might choose to engage us that way? Why not just give us yes, no answers? It seems at first like this would be far more efficient if Jesus would just do this. Tell us what we do or not do. Go from there. And yet our first foundational conviction as a church is that hearing God is all about God's insatiable desire for relationship. And nuance is far more relational way of sharing one's heart. And really, this is true in any relationship. When your teenage son gives you a one-word answer to questions you're asking, does it foster the kind of relationship you are seeking with him? Usually we're hoping for a bit more insight into his day, into his experience, into his heart. It's the same with God. He shares in a more nuanced way many times so that we get a sense of his heart, what is important to him and why it's important to him. Not only that, but he also demonstrates that he knows what's on our hearts. In this particular example, with this touring worship artist, we had an unmistakable sense of how the Lord felt about him and kind of the filter through which he was viewing this scenario. But the Lord also knew the questions we had about perception, about motive, about the need for clarity as to why we would facilitate this. And our sense of what Jesus was perhaps saying to us addressed multiple angles here. So much so that we told, again, I had our worship pastor go and talk with this individual at the time. And again, not just share the final answer. Yes, you can do a CD release on a Sunday morning. But I specifically said, make sure he understands why. What we believed the Lord had said, so that he might feel affirmed and encouraged and seen by the Lord in the process. A couple more stories here. This one is a bit different, illustrates another lesson I learned from Jesus. And this one had to do with a pastoral team hire. And this team hire had quite a lengthy hearing God process to it. So we had a whole host of applicants, but two of whom I thought were potentially good shortlist material. And I had questions and concerns about each of them, thinking, I'm not sure about this for this person, not sure about that for that person. But these are the people who applied. And so I was operating somewhat out of the heart posture of, pursuing the most suitable person for the role. So come to the elders board, and I wanted to do some listening prayer on who we move from the short list and who we should move forward with, and what our next steps should be to discern who is to be part of our team. And as we talked as a board, it was unclear as to what the best way forward was. And we listened to one another, and we were silent before Jesus, saying, how do we move forward with this? And we just were not getting any traction. And honestly, I wasn't really sure what to do. This is very unusual for us as an elders board. Usually we had some sense of the Lord's leading. So we're sitting there, it's kind of quiet, and one of our elders says to the room, he says, I sense the Lord saying to us that we're asking the wrong question. We're assuming the person that Jesus has chosen is here in this list of applicants. But what if they're not? He said, I think we need to back up and begin by asking Jesus, is the person you've chosen in this pile of applicants at all? Now that would be helpful to know, wouldn't it? And so I remember this, we go back, we ask Jesus a different question. I say, so Jesus, is the person you've chosen to join our team one of these applicants? And I remember it's like everyone kind of bows their head to pray. And as soon as I asked that question, it's like everyone's head snaps up and everyone had this unmistakable sense that no, the Lord is saying the person that we're to hire is not anywhere in this list. I'm like, really, Lord? Could they please be here? Like, that'd be a lot easier if one of these people was the right person. But we just sensed that wasn't the case. Right? Because we could ask the Lord till we were blue in the face, which one should we pursue? But we're not going to hear him because we had the wrong question, or perhaps a premature question. We were assuming they were there, but they weren't. And so we learned to ask, in particular, if we're not getting traction on something, it can be helpful to ask Jesus, Jesus, are you interested in speaking to what we're asking? Or is there something else on your mind? Is there another question we should be seeking you on? Okay, one more example of how we operated with this listening prayer posture. And given the size of your church, your context, this may not apply in the same way, but perhaps there are some things to learn, take note of. And for us, that's to do with how our nominating committee functioned. So as you perhaps know, in order to serve as an elder, someone has to be affirmed by the membership through a formal vote. But before we get to that point, usually a nominating committee does background work to put the appropriate number of names forward. And so there's a reasonable amount of power that is entrusted to the nominating committee. And I always wanted to be crystal clear with our nominating committee that our job was to be the chief listening team. That our role was not to choose who our elders would be, but rather to listen to who Jesus had already chosen and assigned the role to. And this process always required multiple rounds of listening prayer. We would always have at least 4 rounds of listening prayer to discern this. So round 1, people would do on their own before we met as a team. We'd say, take the list, identify 6 to 8 people that you think Jesus wants you to bring to this team. And so they would do that. We'd gather as a team. We'd share all the names that had surfaced on our own, and we would write them all on a whiteboard. And sometimes it's quite a list. That was round 1. Round 2, we would ask Jesus, okay, from the list of names that are now recorded on the whiteboard, Jesus, would you highlight for each of us 3 names that we are to continue to consider for nomination? And then we take time just to be quiet. We share, discuss the names that had been highlighted, the ones that were still forefront in our mind. Then we'd go to round 3 and ask Jesus to highlight just 2 names from the remaining list. Pause, be quiet. Then we'd share this, and we'd talk a little bit the names that were still left, and if there were any names that surfaced, we'd engage that. And then we'd go to at least a 4th round and say, Jesus, would you highlight for each of us 1 name that we are still to consider moving forward? So you get the idea. One particular time, we had done 6 rounds of listening prayer as a team, and we still had 4 names that continued to surface in different configurations, but 4 names continued to surface, and we only had 1 spot to fill. And I remember thinking, like, Lord, if this doesn't work, if we don't have a collective sense, what are we supposed to do here? Now, but 7 is the perfect number, and so I thought, let's try one more time and see if any more clarity comes. And I got to tell you, it was amazing to be in the room as after another time of waiting, the 7th time, quietly before the Lord, I said, so what do you think Jesus might be saying? And all 7 of us had the same name, even though up to that point, different names had surfaced at different times. And we had a collective sense, this is who the Lord had chosen for this time. It was such an encouragement to the 7 of us to see how Jesus had made his will known to us as we resisted the temptation to hurry. Remember, one of our convictions, hurry diminishes capacity. And as we sought to demonstrate our genuine desire to know his leading in this decision, to not get ahead of him. So there are times when multiple rounds of listening prayer, even in a single meeting, are necessary to discern what Jesus, as the functional head of the church, is really after. So I would just say to you who are listening, may the Lord grant us grace to stay with him long enough to discern his heart and will in all matters relating to the church. Yeah, I'm just going to encourage you just to consider this question with those who you're gathered with. What story that I've shared here encourages and or instructs and or challenges you in your own leadership decision making? Consider that. Take some time to share your own stories of how God has spoken to you regarding his will in a key decision. Carry on.
Don't miss on Guguda TV.
There are many times when God leads us in directions that are uncomfortable on some level because he wants us to grow, to trust him in greater ways. On the flip side, sometimes as we're seeking to discern our own hearts with regard to a certain decision, even though we may feel relief on the surface because something feels less risky or less unknown, we may become aware of a diminishment of life, peace, and freedom on a deeper level.
So I'm going to encourage you just to pause and consider a time when you were seeking God's direction on a major decision in your life. And think about how you would have answered these first questions in this series and how God may have used them to provide clarity for you as to his will. And then I would encourage you just to share that with those who are around you, how you experienced some forms of confirmation in your own story.
Don't miss on Guguda TV.